In this lesson, we'll cover viewing work-sharing history and also how to restore a corrupt file, whether that be the central file or your local user file that synchronizes to the central file. First, let's look at history. So let's open up that local file that we used within work-sharing. So go to the Open menu, browse to Chapter 19 for this lesson, and choose worksharing_username. Click Open. This again is just opening up that local file. Now, you could open your local file that you created from previous lessons, but you may not have any history if you didn't synchronize. This file has history. So to view the history of what I've done, meaning synchronized, and what others have done, synchronized to the central server, let's click the Collaborate tab. On the Collaborate tab, click Show History. This will then ask me, well, what do you want to view the history of? Your file or the central file? Well, let's choose the central file 1901. Click Open. This will then show me the history of that central file for everyone that is synchronized and when they've synchronized their copies to the central file. Comments are also noted. Now again, in the modified column, I'm user 1. That's how I'm logged into Windows. These are my synchronizations that I've done, and I've added some comments to my synchronizations. I've also seen other synchronizations by other users going back in time. And you may say, well, wow, that goes way back. Well, the file that we used to create the central file was actually one of the sample files that comes with Revit. And it, in turn, was part of a central file back in history or back in time. That's why we see this history here, but it's a good example of what you would actually see if you looked at the history of a file within Worksharing. Now again, the modified could be a name, first initial, last name, full name, a number, totally dependent upon how Windows is configured within your workgroup environment. Again, this is to view the history of a file being synchronized within Worksharing. Let's click Close. Now, let's say your file becomes corrupt, whether it's the central file or your local file. How do you restore it? How do we get that back? Well, luckily, inside of Worksharing, and to show this, I'll browse to the Chapter 19 folder. For every file you create for a user and every file you create for the central file, Revit makes a backup folder with backup information. So I can see the central file 1901 has a backup folder named after it. The Worksharing username folder also has a backup folder named after it. And likewise, from your previous lessons, when you created a user file in your My Documents directory, you'll have a backup directory there as well. So now that we know the backup is there, how do we restore? Let's go back to Revit and close anything that you have open. The first thing you need to do is to create a new blank project. So just click New, choose the template Mechanical, and click OK. This will again create a blank project. Now, for the restore, let's go to the Collaborate tab. On the Collaborate tab, click Restore Backup. This will then ask you to browse to one of the backup folders. Now, depending on what you want to restore, the central file if it's corrupt, or your local user file if it's corrupt, we'll choose the local user file directory. So double-click the Worksharing username backup, which is located in the Chapter 19 folder for this lesson. Select it or double-click it. We'll put it in the folder name on the very bottom. Click Open to see the contents of what you can restore. Now, what's in this folder are actually the synchronization states from when you synchronize. And I can see in this example here, I have 3. So I can choose which one I want to restore from. So in this case, I'm going to choose the first one, Current 1. And all I have to do is choose Save As. This will then ask me to restore this file to a new name in a directory that I want. And then that will then be able to be opened, pulling the information, including the synchronization settings, back to the central server or central file. Same scenario if you restored the central file. This would save that file back to that directory and location, and now you can use it. I'll click Cancel though in this example, and then Close. So as a review, in this lesson, we looked at viewing Worksharing history. We also looked at how do you restore a corrupt file from a backup. For Worksharing history, you can look at the History tab from Collaborate and view the history of either the central file or any user's file on their local computer and see the history of all the synchronizations that have done by you, the user, and other users to that central file. If you have a corrupt file, whether that be the central file or your local user file, luckily Revit creates a backup folder backing up information for the central file and the user file upon synchronizations. To restore, simply close all files, create a new blank project, and then use the Restore Backup on the Collaborate tab, pointing to the backup folder for either the central file or the local user file, and then pick which sync period you would like to restore back to.